Prydeindod, croeso cynnes I chi gyd. Hello and welcome. My name's Kirsty Bohata and I'm co-director of the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales, or CREW, as we're known here at Swansea University. So the study of English literature at Swansea is as old as the university itself, which is entering its second century now. And Swansea has been a pioneer in establishing and nurturing the field of Welsh writing in English, often alongside studying that other literature of Wales in the Welsh language. The first MA in modern Welsh writing in English was established here in 1986, when I was just beginning secondary school. And it was followed by a full university research centre, CREW, in the 90s. And those who know the field will be well aware of Professor M. Wyn Thomas's foundational role in all of this, and also his formative influence on more than one generation of scholars, myself included. So by the time that devolution turned the spotlight onto Wales, at which point we were flooded with invitations to contribute chapters to all sorts of major literary surveys being published by Oxford and Cambridge universities by people who suddenly noticed that Wales did exist. There was already a vibrant, innovative and rapidly expanding field of study. So in 2004, the CREW series of monographs began to appear, and it's been a platform for the international network of scholars working on the English language literary culture of Wales. And as well as that series, in the last few years, CREW has overseen the publication of the landmark Cambridge history of Welsh literature. And just this autumn, a book entitled Welsh English. That is a book on the distinctive forms of English spoken and written in Wales, a variety of English which can be compared to other world Englishes. So today's event marks the publication of the latest 3 titles in the CREW series, which is published by the University of Wales Press. And is co-edited by myself and Daniel Williams. And I'm going to hand over to him now so he can say a few words about the series. Daniel.
Diolch, Kirsty. Wel, a gaf fi hefyd felly estyn croeso cynnes I bawb. We're here, as Kirsty noted, to celebrate and launch the latest volumes in the CREW series, Writing Wales in English, established by Wyn Thomas in 2004. One of the arguments that I've made over the years when encouraging students to work in the field of Welsh writing in English is that they're contributing to the making, the creation of a subject. Compared to the study of canonical writers, the argument goes, the MA dissertations and PhD theses emerging from CREW, the best of them making their way into the series, explore untilled fields and discover new writers, offer new comparative perspectives on Welsh culture and society. But it's more difficult to make that case for originality and newness now that we have over 30 volumes in the series. There's been a dramatic shift, and the shift can be traced in a way in my own career. When I was heading off to follow an MA in the United States in 1995, I went proudly clutching the first volume of the new academic journal established by Wyn Thomas, Tony Brown, Jim Davis, Jane Aron and others, entitled Welsh Writing in English, a yearbook. Family and friends knew of my burgeoning interest in the field, and I actually received 3 copies of that yearbook as Christmas presents. I remember Wyn telling me that the first volume had sold out, but I didn't have the nerve to tell him that half the first print run was in my attic. There was literally almost nothing else out there. Seminal works by Gwyn Jones and Roland Mathias were out of print, as were indeed the key texts of the tradition. And that's been transformed over the past 20 years. The Welsh Government-funded Library of Wales and the series that we're celebrating today, published by the University of Wales Press, funded by HEFCW funding, which is absolutely key to Welsh studies as well. Well, CREW has spearheaded that transformation. And the 3 volumes that we're launching today reflect some of the main strengths and threads of the series. Wyn Thomas's Utopia is a bracing counterblast to British Brexitism. It places Wales in an European context and belongs to a series of comparative studies including Jasmine Donahay's work on Wales, Israel and Palestine, Laura Wainwright's work on Welsh and European modernisms, Kirsty's own work on post-colonialism and Wales, and other studies on Wales and Ireland, the Welsh and American ethnicities. The collection by Rhian Barfoot and Kieran Smith offers new readings of canonical writers, or a new reading of a canonical writer, and their new perspectives on Dylan Thomas sits next to studies and collections on other well-established figures, such as the poet Edward Thomas and R.S. Thomas. It seems if you want to establish an international reputation, being a Thomas helps. And that's quite an admission coming from a Williams. And then there's the volume edited by Sarah Morse and Georgia Burdett. That's the first collection of essays on Ron Berry, who deserves wider recognition for his formal and linguistic experimentation, as much as being an authentic voice of the working class Rhondda. He is one of many neglected writers, from Margaret Evans to Brenda Chamberlain, from Rhys Davies to John Ormond, who've appeared in the series. So I can only encourage you to buy all 3 volumes, and once you've caught the bug, to follow that up with the other 29 in the series. Mae'n bleser gen I nawr felly groesawu'r Athro Elwen Evans I gyflwyno'r Prif Weinidog Mark Drakeford. Rydyn ni wrth gwrs yn hynod ddiolchgar i'r Prif Weinidog am roi o'i amser I fod gyda ni y prynhawn yma, yn enwedig yn y cyfnod anodd hwn. It's my pleasure now to pass on the reins of this afternoon's proceedings to Professor Elwen Evans, QC, Pro Vice-Chancellor and Executive Dean for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch o galon, Daniel. You know what they say, the longer the title, the less the significance. But the great joy of being here today is that we are in a community with a real interest. And I don't know if you're all following the typed up words that are coming at the bottom of the Zoom screen representing, our words, but there's been a fabulous typo. When we've been referring to Welsh language and literature, it's been wealth. So it's come up as wealth. So we are here today to celebrate the wealth that we have as a community in Wales around the language and the culture, whether it's in Welsh, whether it's in English, or whether it's in all those wonderful combinations of the two that so many of us enjoy and engage with. So it's a real privilege to be here today. Croeso cynnes iawn I chi gyd, ac yn arbennig iawn i'n Prif Weinidog. Diolch o galon I chi am wneud yr amser I ymuno â ni yn Abertawe. Gwych wastad eich gweld, ac mae'n fraint I fi gael y cyfle yma I groesawu chi I galon digwyddiad fel hwn. Thank you so very, very much. This is an entirely non-political welcome, but I am going to say that the First Minister is always enormously welcome in Swansea University for all sorts of reasons. And this is the very best sort of reason, that celebration of things that are important to us linguistically, culturally, and where I think we in Swansea are at the heart of that. And I hope that we are also key to it and to its study, well, globally, of course. So thank you very much. And any opportunity to share a screen with Wyn Thomas is always one that I will leap at. And I have to tell you that before we started formally on this, Wyn welcomed the First Minister, and he did it much better, much more effectively than I ever could. And that's an indication of the stature of some of the colleagues, all of the colleagues that we are working with in Crew. I'm a North Walian, and I'm afraid for me, Crew is somewhere where I spent very, very many cold hours on a platform. But when I came to Swansea and when I took over as my new role, I came to know that Crewe was much more important than a place and a railway station. It is something that's at the heart of what we are and who we are. Crewe is also a part of the Richard Burton Centre, and that gives me an entirely appropriate opportunity to mention with most enormous regret and sympathy the loss of Hywel Francis, who was so much a part of many aspects of this endeavour in which we are collectively and passionately involved and engaged. So nobody's come here to listen to me. I'm just here to say thank you so very, very much, everybody, and especially the First Minister. And may I also say this, that I understand that the First Minister has a very full schedule. Well, there's a surprise when you look at some of what's going on around us. Even more fabulous that he's been able to make time to join us, but he may well have to leave us before the end of the event. We fully appreciate that, but I can't tell you how grateful we are that you have joined us. Diolch o galon.
Wel, Elwyn, diolch yn fawr i chi, diolch am y cyflwyniad mor caredig, a diolch wrth gwrs am y cyfle i fod nôl unwaith eto yn Abertawe a prynhawn ma. Thanks very much indeed for that kind introduction. This is my second chance to be with colleagues in Swansea in just a few days, and you know, I've been looking forward to today's event ever since I saw it agreed in the diary, partly because it's been an opportunity to stand back from those things that crowd in on us into those other things that have been so important to us in Wales over the extraordinary last year. I think it was Gwyn Thomas, Elwyn, who described Wales as a wealth of people. So the subtitles may simply be, you know, reflecting the voice of the Rhondda there in that way. And I was reminded when you were speaking of another lineup, maybe from quite the same branch of literature, that well-known song about wanting to go to Birmingham but being taken on to Crewe. So I'm very pleased to be in Crewe rather than Birmingham, just as you were too. And you know, the themes of the afternoon are very important ones, aren't they? The focus today on Wales in the world and Wales and the world. The great challenge for us as a small nation in the post-Brexit context is to go on making sure that Wales is recognised in the world as an outward-looking, engaged nation that welcomes other people to be part of our futures here in Wales, and wants to go on looking out to the world. And our literature is one of the things that allows us to engage with the rest of the world in that way. And there's never been a more important time to do just that. But in the last 12 months as well, when we've all been confined so much more to our own homes and our own localities and unable to do so many other things that we have normally enjoyed in the broader arts as well, literature has been one of those things that has sustained people through the whole experience. The ability to go back and to read and to open imaginatively into the worlds that surround us. And for that reason as well, this is a very timely event in connecting us as individuals with those broader contexts. And as individuals in Wales, you know, we are never far from our literary heritage. I've lost count of the number of times as I was growing up in West Wales that I would be told in hushed tones, and it always was in hushed tones, that my grandmother was a second cousin twice removed of Idi Hwsyn, the famous Welsh poet. It was always said to me I was never left in any doubt about the significance of this family connection. And you know, thank you very much indeed for the bundle of books that arrived in my office last week in advance of today. I've opened and started 2 of them already, and it is partly because you're attracted to things that have some connection to you. So I've made a start on Kieran's book on John Ormond, both because I had the pleasure of hearing Kieran's talk on the book in one of the last events that I was able to go to before the coronavirus crisis began, but also because I heard John Ormond himself. When I first came to Cardiff back in 1979, one of the early events I went to was to hear John Ormond read his own work, and looking forward very much to making my way further into the book. And I've started dipping into the Dylan Thomas book as well. My father was a teacher in Larne School and taught Dylan Thomas's children while he was there. And again, growing up, we would go every 3 years to Larne to see the production of Under Milkwood, which was a tradition in the village at the time, with people in on the stage playing the parts that they had given rise to. So they're immortalized there in the text of Under Milkwood itself. So thank you very much indeed. Today's event, marking the publication of the 3 new titles, is an important moment in Cru's development, but those books will have a much wider audience, and as I say, they will connect directly to many, many people in Wales whose own connections with our language and our literature in English about Wales is so important to us. And I wanted to make one final point myself, if I could, because I have been very keen to promote in the Senedd itself a greater interest in our literature. Always struck me as a bit of a surprise. We have many, many musical events at the Senedd. You know, barely a week goes by that there isn't some event that celebrates our musical heritage. But you know, in an occupation, you know, politicians rely on words. It's what we use all the time. We are forever, and sometimes at inordinate length, you know, creating words to try to explain what we are doing and to communicate with others. And yet our literature is seldom marked in the events that surround the Senedd all the time. So I've been very lucky to be involved in 2 such events. The fantastic event that marked the end of the Cymru'n Cofio programme, the 4-year programme of commemorating the centenary of the First World War, and the Holy Glimmers of Goodbye event, which involved readings of literature produced in Wales around the theme of war and warfare, but also commissioned new work from Gillian Clark and other Welsh writers of today. Was a day-long event, and a fantastic event it was too. And it came after an event which I was very pleased indeed to be able to sponsor, in which we marked the 50-year anniversary of the death of that other great Swansea poet. And in some ways, in some aspects, my favourite Swansea poet, Vernon Watkins. Look forward very much to seeing a book in the series giving him the attention and his poetry the attention that it absolutely deserves. And this is an open invitation, really, to people in the centre to help us to deliver more events at and around the Senedd when we're able to be back there again, marking, celebrating, exploring and extending our sense of what that literature tells us about what it is to be Welsh and what it is to be in Wales today. And I know that today's event will mark an important moment in that as well, because we're soon to hear from Professor Wyn Thomas. I'm looking forward very much indeed to hearing from him on his own book, which is being launched today. Wedi glywed yr athro Wyn Thomas wrth cwrs, a clywed oddi wrth am y llyfr a fi'n cael ei lansio yma heddiw. Thank you very much indeed for all that you do to support this rich and vital part of our cultural life in Wales. Looking forward very much to being able to stay with you a short while longer to enjoy the event.
Wel, diolch mawr iawn I chi, Prydeindod. Fe o'n I bod ni'n gyfnod anodd, ac yn gwerthfawrogi'ch presenoldeb chi, mae'n disgwyl ffordd i'r pwysigrwydd o studio yn llenyddiaeth ein hunain, sef y llenyddiaeth Saesneg a Chymraeg Cymru. I'm so happens the chair of the Welsh Books Council. I know, therefore, through that body, that you're a genuine lover of books. I've always been very aware of that and very pleased about it. You mentioned Vernon Watkins. Vernon Watkins was, believe it or not, a colleague of mine in 1966 at Swansea. He was so absent-minded, he had to tie the key to his room around his neck so that he would actually have to kneel down and put it in the lock and open the door. And then, of course, it would still be safe when he'd need it again. His presence there was important because he was influential, for example, on Tony Curtis, who went on to become now one of the contemporary Wales's leading English language poets. I really think we should take advantage of your kind invitation. We have the means at Swansea, I think, of putting on an event to celebrate Vernon Watkins, including, by the way, John Ormond's great film of Vernon Watkins, which is a classic. And that alone would make a fine centerpiece for any future event at a cinema. So diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Nw'n I gymryd mantes hwnnw fan o'ch cynnig caredig chi. I know you'll have to leave now shortly anyway, so please don't feel constrained to wait any longer. But I am expected to say a few words about Utopia, which I shall now duly do. Starting by noting that Crew has always attracted students from all over Europe, as well as from the US and Canada and Mexico and the Far East. So it seems appropriate that my new volume, which is Utopia, expose a variety of examples of Euro-Welshness spanning more than a century. And it, in fact, completes my trilogy of studies, to be pretentious, of images of Wales, the others being In the Shadow of the Pulpit and The Nations of Wales. And two of the motives behind it are neatly summarized by two of the epigraphs I've chosen. And the first comes from a TV quiz show. And the questioner asks, the Italian sculptor Michelangelo was born in which European country? Contestant, France. Well, the Welsh are as ignorant as any other of the peoples of Britain of the cultural richness of Europe, and it's a deficiency I regard as deeply damaging, I must say. And then there's a second epigraph, which is taken from my late friend, the great Emil Humphreys, who says, to be European, we first need to be more Welsh. And Utopia examines, therefore, the work of writers and intellectuals who are sufficiently aware of their own distinctive Welsh cultural inheritance to be able to appreciate how it had been, and still could be, enriched through its connections with the majestic cultural inheritance of Europe. Euro-Welshness, well, it comes in a wide variety of forms. Among them are the following. Start of the 19th century, nonconformity. It viewed Europe through the lens of smug superiority, which is offered by British liberalism of that period. They believed Britain to be well in advance of Europe because of its progressive democratic government. And they also thought it was the Calvinistic Protestantism that Wales shared with Northern Europe that had been the engine driving the emergence of a modern democratic society. But then by century's end, some in Wales began to realize that both the multilingualism of the countries of Europe and the struggles for self-government of figures like Mazzini and Garibaldi were relevant to their own case. With the outbreak of World War I, interest in Europe among Welsh intellectuals grew intense, and it's astonishing and indeed shaming to discover the range of cultures and writers regularly featured in the pages of the periodical The Welsh Outlook during that 4-year period. France and Belgium, you'd expect that, but also Spain, Italy, the Baltic countries, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the countries of the Balkans, even Russia. All these were intensively examined. How parochial we've come since those days, it seems to me. And at war's end, the Outlook looked to Lloyd George to secure for Wales the same modest degree of self-rule that he'd promised to several of the smaller nations of Europe. His failure to do that was a disappointment so crushing that several of the leading figures transferred their allegiance to the fledgling United Nations and the cause of international peace. And Lord Davies of Llandinam, for example, endowed the world's first chair in international politics, Aberystwyth, and erected the Temple of Peace. And then in the realm of culture, well, where do you start? The brilliant efflorescence that was the Renaissance of Welsh language literature was powered by an inspiring awareness of European modernism, brought to the attention of young writers who travelled to places like Freiburg and Paris for education. And a strong translation culture emerged, and that too, very, very sadly, has waned over the last decades. Out of the background that I'm describing, there emerged the towering post-war figure of Saunders Lewis. And his was a magisterial vision of a Welsh culture that had first emerged out of the ruins of the Europe-wide Roman Empire, then developed to its first glorious maturity under the auspices of the Europe-wide Catholic Church. Then at the opposite pole from Lewis's socially, politically, and culturally conservative model of Europeanism was a left-wing version, arising out of Welsh sympathy for the struggles of the workers in the Spanish Civil War. You probably know refugee children from Asturias were looked after in Caerleon and in here in Swansea. We offer a home to those refugees during the Spanish Civil War. And this model favoured the formation of a common front between the oppressed miners of South Wales and the struggling proletariat of Euskadi and other similar regions of Spain. And likewise left-inclining was the admiration shown by leading Welsh intellectuals for the communitarian political culture of Scandinavia. And this influenced both the economic policy of Plaid Cymru, the National Party of Wales, and the campaign that led to the foundation of the Welsh National Folk Museum at St Faggan near Cardiff. Also, Welsh journalists, they too were once upon a time European in outlook. One worked in Romania at the end of the war, had a first-hand view there of the makings in Eastern Europe of the Soviet Empire, and another, known, I hope, to most of you, the internationally renowned Gareth Jones, a Barry boy, eventually paid the price with his own life for bringing Stalin's evil policy of mass starvation in Ukraine to the attention of an unbelieving world. There's a film recently, of course, that came out last year, I think, about Gareth Jones' remarkable life and very, very sad and mysterious ending. An intriguing female image of Europe also emerged in the work of women writers, including Elena Phillips, who became a friend of Edith Piaf, and Kate Boscovich, a remarkable refugee from Nazi Germany. And there was also a dimension in the creative thinking of several of the Welsh avant-garde writers of the day. It's no accident that Dylan Thomas, self-mockingly agreed, styled himself the Rambo of Cwmdonkin Drive. And that is testimony to the attraction of continental symbolism from Baudelaire to Rilke and Lorca for poets working both in Welsh and in English. Wartime experience in Europe left a profound mark on the mind and writings of several writers, most notably Emyr Humphreys, the great novelist, who spent a period administrating a large refugee camp in Florence. And his vision of a Wales in Europe constantly evolved throughout the 70 years of his writing career, and he ended up believing that the only choice for his country was between becoming an American Wales or an European Wales. And he was convinced the survival of Wales depended on his choosing the latter. And then finally, if you come to the 1970s, you have the launch of the periodical Planet under the editorship of perhaps the greatest of Welsh Europhiles, still with us, I'm glad to say, Ned Thomas. And that marked the beginning of a golden age of intellectual Euro-Welshness. It approached that connection from the vantage point of the left, and that was an approach that, of course, came to be powerfully advocated by Raymond Williams and the charismatic Gwynalf Williams. And its vision was a Europe of the regions. Now, utopia appears, alas, far too late to prevent the disaster for Wales that is Brexit. But my hope is it may just possibly rekindle sufficient interest in Euro-Welshness to help the next generation begin the work of recovering a little, at least, of what's been so carelessly and tragically lost. Because in the wake of Brexit, Wales is in very great danger of becoming nothing but England's little butty, as Harry Webb witheringly put it. An ardent Euro-Welshman, heavily influenced by the post-colonial theorising of France panel, Webb shared with all the writers, all the thinkers examined in Utopia, the conviction that a strong creative connection directly with Europe offered a lifeline upon which Wales could depend for survival. Now, our unlikely, to me, Triple Crown victory against England last Saturday proved we've still got good friends on the continent. French referees are top of the pops as far as I'm concerned. And as the late John Morris argued, Wales needs now more than ever to reposition itself as one of the many multilingual sub-state nations of Europe. As this volume demonstrates, Wales has never been insular. Its challenge now will be to identify those of its interests that best coincide with what Europe has to offer. And any Welsh rapprochement with Europe is likely to be, interestingly these days, out of a recognition of mutual weakness, as well as the mutual interests and mutual strengths. Because let's face it, all the non-state nations are facing the same twin threats: effacement by global Anglo-British capitalism and marginalization within a centralizing Europe where power increasingly lies with the great traditional states. And that's enough from me. My Utopia isn't the only book being launched here today. I'm so pleased, therefore, to be able to now yield the time to the others who are launching their books. And for that purpose, I hand you over now to Professor Daniel Williams.
Diolch o galon, Wyn. So many threads to potentially follow there. We could have a discussion all afternoon based on what you've just presented. But as you say, we have to move on. In bringing Euro-Welshness back into contemporary consciousness, Utopia certainly offers the necessary cultural resources for those of us refusing to abandon our Welsh European identity. Just picking up on your mention of Raymond Williams, it's of course Raymond Williams' centenary this year, so there'll be future events focusing on that as well. I must say, I have some sympathy with the quiz contestant. I mean, if I was there and the quizmaster said Italian sculptor, I'd assume it was a trick question and might have answered France myself. So remind me never to go on a quiz show. But had the question been, say, where was the Italian patriot Garibaldi born? The answer would have been France. The point being perhaps that the boundaries of European nations have not been static, and neither are the boundaries of culture, which brings us to perhaps the most transnational, shape-shifting, allegedly universal of our poets, Dylan Thomas. Rhian Barfoot and Kieran Smith both completed their PhD theses with us here at Swansea and have both written fine monographs in the Crew series, Rhian on Dylan Thomas, and we've already heard about Kieran's work on John Ormond. And they joined forces to produce this fine book of new essays. I can hold it up. And this is basically an opportunity for me to ask them some questions about it. So let me start with you then, Rhian. One of those straightforward but very difficult to answer questions. What's new in the book? What's the contribution of this book to Dylan Thomas studies? You'll need to unmute yourself, Rhian. There you go.
Thank you for that, Daniel, and yeah, thank you for that inspiring as ever talk from Wyn. Yeah, Daniel, what's different? I think this was the first occasion in which we managed to cover all of the genres that Thomas worked in. It was important to us that the purpose of the book was to showcase new writing from young researchers and current, there were some current students involved initially, although the necessary limitations of time meant that most of those dropped out. But we wanted to use this as an opportunity to showcase work from young new researchers and also from some of the celebrated voices of the field of Welsh writing studies, some of the most established voices, and also that we covered, as I said, all of the genres in which Thomas worked in. Thomas is renowned, of course, as a poet, and Milkwood is one of his celebrated works for radio, but often the comedy of the letters is overlooked, and Wynne managed to produce a marvellous piece for us on the comic nature of the letters and correspondence. We had pieces on the short stories of Dylan Thomas. We also had an excellent piece from John Goodby on the war films, the propaganda, which outside the field of Dylan Thomas studies are perhaps not so well known. And there was also the fantastic, what I think is a fantastic contribution from Kieran himself that placed Thomas in his current cultural context. So we tried to cover broadly all those genres that Thomas engaged in. I mean, the title of the book, A Writer of Words and Nothing Else, and we posed a question mark after that, because Thomas, of course, was so much more than that. Yes, his art, his craft was embedded in wordsmithery and wordcraft. He loved words above all else. Great linguistic experimenter. But he worked in so many genres and destabilized so many of those genres.
Thank you, Fian. Yes, well, you gave us a nice sense of the range of the volume then. I enjoyed everything in it, I must confess. And it opens up a lot of different avenues as well. You mentioned Kieran's chapter, which I agree is a fine chapter. It's different to the others, Kieran, in that it's not so much about the work, it's about administrating Dylan Thomas, as you describe it, especially during 2014, the centenary year. A chapter about the uses and abuses of Dylan, maybe. So maybe developing on it or drawing on some of the ideas within it. What do you think is Thomas's place within Welsh studies today and perhaps within our broader culture?
Yeah, that was sort of the point I was trying to make in the chapter. Is it was more a focus on the way his work has and the idea of Dylan Thomas has been represented. And what's interesting about Dylan Thomas is, of course, that he is probably one of Wales's most famous exports. He's got an international reputation, and you know, if you take the 2014 film Interstellar, then he's got a cosmic kind of reputation as well, because he's widely, you know, his work is widely used in that film. So you know, Hollywood movies are using him, but what's interesting to me is the way that he's kind of he's a figure that's pulled in lots of different directions. And I think that is the case in Welsh studies as well. You know, there are competing ideas around his significance as a figure and as a writer, and whether he's representative of Welshness or the Welsh experience, or whether he's representative of a more Anglophilic kind of understanding of the way we think about Welshness and Britishness. But I think the important thing, you know, to look at today is the fact that his work complicates these questions, and he invites us to think about the nuances and the substance of culture itself. You know, I think we're living in an age at the moment where things are easily dismissed on the basis of very superficial ideas, and I think Thomas's work is dense and complex and contradictory enough that it does invite us to look at the nuances of writers and their identities, you know, and to think about the nuances of Welsh identity, you know, which is a more complex and contradictory thing than I think is sometimes, you know, we're sometimes led to believe.
Amen to that, for sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of our field, of course, I mean, Dylan is very useful in that he gives us that kind of international platform, but then Wales helps us to understand Dylan? The First Minister mentioned Vernon Watkins, that circle of writers, his connections with the emergence of Welsh writing in English as a kind of formation in the 30s, and then there's a piece in here on the movement poets and so forth. Rhian, your contribution to the field in some ways has been to develop kind of psychoanalytic readings of Thomas. The chapter in the book, like your study, Liberating Dylan Thomas, draws on psychoanalytic models to explore kind of the subversive and festive, perhaps, radicalism of Thomas's writings. I think that's your term in the conclusion, rather than sort of the childish infantilism that he's been accused of by some psychoanalytic kind of readings in the past. Now, I appreciate it's very difficult to summarize your argument in a few minutes, but can you tell us briefly, why you think Thomas is important for, for psychoanalytic readings of him? Why is he important for psychoanalysis? Why is psychoanalysis important for Thomas? Could you answer that in some form? Mute again. You're repressed, Rhea. You still need to unmute yourself, Rhea.
Gosh, what with the failure to unmute myself on the grass background, which is certainly not intentional. My own interest in Dylan Thomas and his relevance to psychoanalysis developed as an undergraduate when I started reading Lacan at the same time as I started reading Dylan Thomas. And Lacan informed my reading of Dylan Thomas, and Dylan Thomas informed my reading of Lacan. Lacan, post-Freudian psychoanalysis, is hugely important to a study of Thomas and vice versa, because it's all linguistics based. It's about psycholinguistic development. And of course, that's very international, because you look at people like Kristeva, Jacques Lacan, and into wider post-structuralism like Derrida. And of course, in the book, we've got the Shibboleth for Dylan Thomas by Thomas Owen, which is, as somebody that's kneeled at the altar of post-structuralism more times than she cared to remember, I was delighted to see, Derrida being applied to Dylan Thomas. But yeah, post-Freudian psychoanalysis tends to be very European, very international in its impetus. And its basis is linguistic. And of course, Thomas's linguistic experimentation lends itself to that. Of course, Thomas, we now know, was on subscription list to Transition, which was an international journal of poetics and language during the 30s. And Eugene Jolas's Revolution of the Word, was reproduced in part in that magazine. So Thomas always had a healthy interest in internationalism, his interest in language and his own wordplay, and interest in materiality of language and linguistic development was very much hand in hand with post-Freudian psychoanalysis. In some ways, you might say that From Love's First Fever actually is paradigmatic of post-Freudian psychoanalytic linguistic development. And yeah, obviously necessary limitations of time, space and other people's interest preclude any discussion of that here. But yes, for me, post-Freudian psychoanalysis and Dylan Thomas lend themselves to imminent readings. It's not so much a case of having to bolt this stuff on to Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, the ideas emerge from the work, Rhian. Yeah, well, that's an excellent answer. And we need to remember, of course, that we had Ernest Jones as a Welshman, as Freud's right-hand man. There's something in some ways perhaps about the Welsh experience that does particularly make a psychoanalytic reading relevant and interesting. Thomas Owen's Shibboleth piece, it draws that out. Lenny Bruce, you might remember, had a skit where he named all kinds of various marginal figures from around the world and claimed them for a Jewish tradition, and Dylan Thomas was one of the names he mentioned. So there's kind of a Jewish Dylan Thomas that brings in the Jewish science of psychoanalysis read him. I mean, that's just one of the many threads in the book that I think it was opening up. I can see we're kind of running out of time, so let me just urge everyone to buy the book. I hope we hear more from Kieran and Trian as we move on to the questions towards the end of our session. But as I said, it's a terrific collection, and I congratulate you both very warmly on it, and both Kirsty and I are thrilled to have it in the series. It contains all kinds of threads for future exploration in the work in the future, and builds, of course, on the innovative work on Dylan and theory that John Goodby had innovated with us in Crew. So on that note, let's move on from Swansea to Blaen Cwm and Ron Berry. Kirsty.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, and thank you to Rhian and Kieran. It was particularly good to see that book come out, because it arose from the 2014 conference that we held at Crew, although it brought in some new writing as well. So moving on to our third and final book, which is rather one. I can't hold things up to camera. There you go. You can see the birds. Fight and Flight, Essays on Ron Berry, edited by Dr. Georgia Burdett and Dr. Sarah Morse, who both worked on Berry as part of their wider doctoral research at Crew. Now, Berry is often framed as an overlooked writer, somebody that we should know about, but that we tend not to read enough. And I mean, I have to confess, I really regret not having discovered Ron Berry a little bit earlier in my own doctoral research, as he would have fitted in really well, but I didn't. So for those of you who don't know Ron Berry, I wonder, Sarah, if you could just introduce him, tell us a bit about him and his writing.
Certainly, thanks, Kirsty. I think that Ron Berry is probably the best Welsh writer people have never heard of. It was his centenary last year, and unfortunately we weren't able to celebrate his life and his work in the way that we had wished to, and hopefully there'll be some more events later this year to do that. But where to start and how to sum up Ron? He was sort of a Ron the Renaissance man, I guess. He left school at 14 to work underground. He was a near professional footballer, took up boxing, worked as a lifeguard, was in the Merchant Navy and the Army during the Second World War. His mining career finished in his early 20s due to a footballing injury. He was an avid angler, bird watcher. He was a student at Harlech College, where he started, I think that's where he started writing. And he devoured the books of the Miners' Institute in Blaen Cwm and the Upper Rhondda Fawr, and again was interested in Rambo, was interested in a very wide range of authors and literatures, and wrote some really interesting work. There are 6 published novels, an autobiography, a nature book called Peregrine Watching. There's plays for radio and many unpublished works in his papers, which are in the Richard Burton archives. I only wish I'd spent more time in the archives with those papers, because I'm probably never going to get the chance to go back and recreate the time I had during my PhD, but there we go. It's a job for somebody else. But his work is a real shift from the industrial fiction before him. He's not like the writers of the 1930s. He's almost more in the angry young men tradition of the 1960s, except he wasn't a young man when he was writing. He was a generation older than the writers of that movement. He writes of a very distinctive Rhondda. It's before the mines close. People have money. Mines are closing gradually, but there's other work for people. And he also captures a time when women are going out to work and how men come to terms with their changing roles. He also wrote, we'll probably touch on this later, but he was very much of his place. He is of, not even the Rhondda, he is of Blaen Cwm, which, if people haven't visited, is sort of a place apart. It's right at the top of the Rhondda Fawr, just tucked in off the main valley, surrounded by mountains, and it is a really distinctive place. He worked in a mine. I think he worked in a level mine that was accessed behind a waterfall. So he had a really interesting perspective on industry, nature, the environment, geology, history, people's place in the world. So yeah, if people haven't read his work, I would recommend starting with Flame and Slag. It's probably the most accessible of the work.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. It gets a real sense of his range and hopefully a taster to people who might want to go and pursue more of his work, his published writing. Georgia, you studied Barry's disability writing in particular, and again, well, by this time I did know his work. He was just outside the range of the period of writing that I was looking at when I was studying disability in the Industrial Society project at Swansea. But we know from that and from your research that disability really is a very prominent feature of Coalfields literature, and it was also, you know, it's a routine part of colliery life. It was regarded as kind of inevitable. But how, as Sarah said, Barry isn't one of the 30s writers. So how does he approach the topic and the concept of disability?
Oh, thanks, Kirsty. Like Sarah, I was introduced to Ron Barry's work when I began my PhD studies at Swansea. I was looking for a starting point for more contemporary writers. I really wanted to focus on later writing from Wales from the 90s onwards. So I was really looking at somebody who could span that industrial, de-industrial, post-industrial time frame, and Ron did all of that for me. So like you said, there are a huge number of representations of disabled protagonists in Barry's work, and given the industrial, de-industrial, post-industrial setting of the Rhondda, it's perhaps unsurprising. But what we see a lot of in Barry is these representations of cripples, moochers, lungers, victims of pneumoconiosis, and you know, miners certified in percentage of dust. There are some characters in his fiction who are certified 100% dust. So it's safe to say Barry's Rhondda's no pre-Thatcherite Eden. For Barry, it's part of the life course disability. It's a factor in everyday life, and he certainly doesn't treat able-bodiedness complacently. I think he kind of has an unjudgmental familiarity with disability and how it works in the context of this persistent macho, high-risk work culture. So in his writing we see, you know, it's not just an elegy for a particular industry, but elegies for the types of male bodies that inhabit those industries. And what we really start to see that we probably don't see before is that ordinary disabled people who are no longer part of the workforce, their stories are important, their voices and opinions are important, and they can be the subject of narrative, and their stories matter. Like Sarah mentioned, because arguably Barry turned to writing as a result of his disability. He had a ferocious physicality as a young man. He was an avid walker. He'd cycle marathon distances. He was referred to himself as a Shawnee Tarzan. He really was quite an athletic young man. So decreasing mobility after a football accident when he used to play for Swansea Town, that was a real personal tragedy for him. He serrated his knee joint, I believe, and that really affected what he was able to do physically as time went on. But thematically, he's really quite progressive in his treatments of disability as well, because he wrote there's an unpublished short story in the archives written in the 80s, and it's called The Inadequates. It's about a group of disabled men. But Barry really struggles with the correct terminology to apply to these characters, and you can see in the margins of the work that he scribbled things out several times until he settles on The Inadequates as a title. It was called The Disabled, but he's changed his mind after that. So there's some really interesting things you can look at in Barry's work. He also looks at things like how people can be part of the working class, how disabled people can be part of the working class when they no longer work, and how disability affects class perception, which is really quite, ahead of his time, really. And also how gender roles can be affected in the family, the onset of the minor's disability. So there's loads of things to look at with Barry. He's brilliant.
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, those terms, that question of terminology, the question of identity and disability in relationship to work, all of those are really central questions that are still kind of constantly debated. You can't have a discussion of disability without a discussion around language, certainly not yet. Sarah, I'm going to keep with my pet topics, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit about Barry's environmentalism. He's again another sort of pioneer in this area, although this seems quite surprising because it's not necessarily what you'd automatically expect from somebody who's also labelled an industrial writer. So can you tell us about your research on his environmentalism?
Yeah, his environmentalism, it's there in some of the fiction. It's also there in his autobiographical work and obviously in his nature work. But he's got a really close relationship with the upland Rhondda, with Rhugos Top, with being out of the village and up in the wilds. He spent months watching peregrines at Llinfawr and recorded that in the book. He railed against the afforestation of the Upper Rhondda by the Forestry Commission, which linked again to his experience of somebody with disability, because it was reducing his access. He could no longer walk on the hillsides. Because of disability, he couldn't climb over the fences. He was being excluded twice over. One, because of his health and because of his mobility, and secondly, because he just couldn't get up there anymore. You had to walk on the hills, you'd have to scrabble about under the sitkas. And so he reflected on how the local community was being excluded from land that it considered part of their inheritance, or part of their experience of living in that community. He also really captured the fact that he was really conscious of environmental degradation. He'd seen the state of the Rhondda River during the time, how polluted it was, but in the 70s and 80s he was part of, I don't quite know how he did it, but he managed to put brown trout back in the river on the back of a moped with some buckets and a friend. But he was sort of doing this underground proper environmental activism in repairing the damage of industry. He went on in the papers. There's evidence of quite a long letter campaign, an activism against ideas for a Rhondda Recreation Park, which was going to rehabilitate the Forestry Commission forest as a leisure space. I'm not quite sure what he'd make of the zip line at Rhugos, but he'd probably be more in favour of that than the sanitised nature that was being proposed by this project. But it is starting to find somebody who, when you initially approach his work, you think, oh, he's another minor with an E writer. And he is that, but he takes that and he takes his interest in the environment underground with him. There's more than one passage about miners underground seeing fossils, being aware that they're going through strata of time as they excavate, as they go underground, and this really long idea of this long comprehension of time, that humans are just one stage of the life on Earth. And so he's got this really long view of the importance of the environment and nature.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's an area I want to look at much more. And there are essays, obviously, by you and Georgia in the book on environmentalism and disability, kind of where the time is going. But I wanted to give Georgia just a really small amount of time, we might have to extend this into Q&A later. But George, if you could just briefly tell us about some of the other elements of Bury that you wanted to capture, that you did capture in this book.
Yes, so ultimately our volume of essays was the first attempt at collating critical interpretations of Bury, and his centenary in 2020 was the opportune now or never moment, really. We unceremoniously disturbed a lot of academics in their retirement and begged them to submit something to this, particularly people who had met Bury in person, like Professor Dai Smith, John Pacoulis. We really wanted their input, and we were delighted when they were willing to contribute, because Dai Smith had been an advocate for Bury for a long time, for many decades. So yeah, and we were really lucky as well, because we had the support and insight from Bury's family, particularly his daughters Maggie and Simone, and they were able to put together an afterword for the volume, which they admit that they did with some trepidation, but it definitely added a dimension of our understanding that was completely missing, and it's got such a value. So we're really, really grateful that they were able to do that. Otherwise, we were lucky enough to collate pieces like Barbara Priest-Williams's essay on Bury and his autobiography. We've got an essay by Tony Brown on masculinity in the short stories. And we've got a piece on sport by Dara Lee Worthy, which is really insightful. And we really wanted to use this collection as a springboard for further work into Bury. We were really keen just to finish off on with an essay on his literary legacy, perhaps with writers like Niall Griffiths and Rachel Trezise. So Thomas Owen did that for us. He was able to write a piece comparing Bury's representations of birds with that of Niall Griffiths, and you can really see the physicality in the language there, the sections of vernacular dialogue and elevated passages, and how Griffiths has inherited that kind of style from Bury. So yeah, there were loads of things we would have really liked to have included, but we've definitely got scope for future work, particularly on women. I think that we all touched on women in our particular essays, but there's definitely a fuller work to be done there.
I will talk to some Crew students. I think we can definitely make some headway there. That's brilliant. It really, yeah, it's a really appealing book, and there will be links in the chat. You can go through, buy it. I think there's even a discount at the moment, certainly on the Dylan Thomas and the Ron Bury books. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor David Britton, who is the head of the Department of English and Creative Writing at Swansea, although more people will probably know him as a celebrated dramatist, DJ Britton. David's going to say a few words on him. Basically, he's in charge now. I'm handing over to you, David. You're going to deal with the Q&A and everything else.
Thanks, Kirsty. I've made the terrible mistake of being so fascinated by what everybody else was saying that I'm completely unprepared. But that shows, I think, just how really fascinating, interesting this session has been. So I'm burbling on now in order to catch up with what I thought I was going to say, which is what people have been saying during this session seems to resound very much with me as somebody who's come to Wales from Australia, where and worked in many other places in the world, Canada, America, the Far East, where the prowess of Welsh writing is actually perhaps one of the strongest exports that we have, and that whereas you will get people knowing the heroes of Welsh rugby and Tom Jones, the name that and possibly a statesman like Lloyd George, but other than that, the names that people know are the names of Welsh writers, and of course that Dylan Thomas, as we heard from Kieran is absolutely central to that. But other writers, you know, I would come across in conversation, contemporary writers like Gillian Clarke. These days, people phone me and say, "Who's this Russell T Davies?" You know, so I think we should be very, very clear that this is a really important part of the way that Wales presents it to the world. And I'm tremendously proud of the work of Crew in, it seems to me, linking analytical and historic perspectives with the current situation of writing in Wales, which of course is also very important to us in Swansea, where we have such a strong creative writing programme. Obviously, the staff in Swansea, well, our founders, Stevie Davis and Nigel Jenkins, put us on such a strong track for publication, and the staff are now publishing in large amounts. And I think also we should remember that there's also a student aspect to that. That only today we heard that Perry Wyatt, one of our PhD students, has just got a publishing contract. And I think this is so the continuity, what I'm trying to say, is between analysis, scholarship and creativity is something that I think is unique to Swansea, and we're kind of very proud of that. And it plays absolutely into what has been said today. I'm saying this while I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A, because what we want to do, of course, is invite everybody now to raise questions with our fantastic panelists. I have some for myself, but actually there are some questions already in. And I think the first one is really probably mainly from Amber, is probably mainly aimed at Wyn. I'm just looking at the end of what Amber has written. What do you think are some of the reasons behind Wales's possible loss of connection in a literary sense, I think, with the broader European identity? Wyn, what's caused that diminution, I suppose, is what the gist of that question.
I'm not sure I can answer it, but to just reflect for a minute, the strongest connection has always been between Welsh language Wales and the continent. And you can probably understand why, because English language Wales, many of them are very understandably and probably content with being monolingual Welsh, which means Welsh people whose lives are lived with the medium of English. And for the such to be deeply interested in the continent instinctively means quite an effort of imagination, really, because they are not used to living in a multilingual environment. Now, that has always, I think, hampered the development of a strong sense of Euro-Welshness amongst those once called Anglo-Welsh. I think it's different these days because people travel more. But as travel, at least until recently, until COVID, became easy, so of course, invariably, it became popularized and, quite frankly, trivialized. It became very easy to go to the continent and not bother yourself with any of the languages spoken there, for example. You just went to the beaches. And of course, the universal language of the beaches is English. So that has also, in a way, discouraged the development of a linguistic and cultural awareness among the non-Welsh speakers. As for the Welsh speakers, probably there's less diminution there of any awareness of a European identity, but they are marginal in modern Wales. So about a fifth of us who are bilingual, and therefore we don't impact so strongly on the culture at large. So I think it's a combination of circumstances. It's the cheapening, really, of the whole concept anyway, of what it means these days to be familiar with Europe and to relate to it. which has more or less eviscerated the cultural distinctiveness and richness.
Okay, Wyn, I'm going to come in there and say, as a quick analysis, that's excellent. Don't go, Wyn, because you've got a follow-up question now. So Wyn, if that's your analysis, then what do we do about it? That's the hard question.
Well, I think I'm an academic, so I'm not sure I'm the right one to answer this question at all, really. But I would like there to be, as this book sets out anyway, its aim is to familiarise both the peoples of Wales, regardless of their language, with the Welsh past and such connections as have been passed down to us potentially from that past between Wales and Europe. I don't think that I started out writing this book partly because I was dismayed, to be honest with you, when the Brexit debates were starting. There was endless talk about the economic implications of a break with Europe for Wales, the political consequences of such a break. At no point from then until now have I ever heard anybody mention the cultural loss that would result if Wales were to become disconnected from Europe. And the first thing I think that Wales is made aware of is that there is a history of that sort of connection, cultural connection, that has been beneficial to Wales in the past and that can continue to be so for the future. I mean, what makes Wales distinctive, to be honest, it seems to me, in the eyes of Europe and the world, is that it is bilingual, multilingual. It's about time that Wales began to identify itself as such in its dealings with Europe. I think that will be a first step. And because recently, thank heavens, since establishing the Senedd, Wales is now officially recognised as being bilingual, officially recognises itself as being bilingual. I think it's about time we began to explore and exploit the advantages of that image that we now have. And it's how we do that. I think government has got a role to play in that. And I don't think government either, Mark Drakeford isn't present now, I don't think Welsh Government has been sufficiently, as it were, aware of the potential of playing its European card properly. It seems...
I think that's a strong argument, Wyn, and thanks for that. I'm going to move on because the questions are beginning to come in. We've got questions, one for Georgia from Ryan Sweet. Georgia asking about the effect of perceptions of Welsh masculinity in Berry's work. How does that affect the perceptions of disability? So I suppose that is the particular Welsh perception of masculinity crucial to the way that Berry presents disability?
Yeah, I think definitely. There's one short story written by Berry called Time Spent, and there's a protagonist there called Lewis Rimmer, who's certified, I think, as 90% or 100% dust. So he's going to be struck off basically with compensation. But that doesn't seem, that's not enough of a disability to him. And what he proceeds to do then is to break his own arm as well. There has to be some kind of outward sign of disability, physical sign of disability, as well as something as an invisible disability. And you see a lot of that in Berry. Like the men in Berry's short fiction, they're quite capable of making things look worse. They try and make things look worse for themselves. He needs a physical badge of the validity of his disability, and we do see that quite a lot with Berry. There's a little quote from that which I can read out, which would reinforce that point. This is from Time Spent, one of Ron Berry's short stories. Lewis Rimmer says, "In disbelief, by Jesus, men are pegging out with 50%. I'm miles from that state. Rough chest first thing in the morning. short of breath until the circulation starts moving. Good Christ almighty, 57 packing it in at my age. It doesn't make sense. Bloody hell. There's colliers and vow clause and pension time. Old plodders clearing their yardage every shift. Me, I'm on the bloody scrap heap.
And there's a follow-up question, excuse me, which seems quite a complex one, but for both yourself and Sarah, I think, which is there something more than physically transformative about Barry's depiction of disability? Is there something that is, I suppose, more deeply transformative, and is that specifically Welsh and drawn from the very nature of Welsh industry? Quite a difficult question, but actually a really interesting one, I have to say. Well, Sarah, you have a go at that.
Oof, I'll have a stab. I think, I'm not quite sure if this answers the question, but Barry also looks at the psychological impact of disability and the changes that it brings about in people's experience. He talks himself of when he's dealing with his injury, walking on the hills with a friend who has TB, and that they have an opportunity to be on the hills in daytime because they're not working, and the sense of freedom that gives them, but it's a limited freedom. It's just a different experience, and it gives them a different perspective. And Barry goes further than that and mentions that he made a hide on the hills to sit in, to watch birds and other wildlife, and he contemplates what his writing could have been if he'd ever chosen to write in that space. And he said he could never do it because it would have been too much. And so he's very, very aware of the psychological impact of everything he's dealing with. I'm not sure that's particularly Welsh. I think it's just to do with industry and the particularity of that place at that time.
That's really interesting, Sarah. I know Kirsty wants to come in on this one, so Kirsty.
Button. I'm okay. I to be honest think that they've been answered really fully. It's I suppose my only comment about the way that disability and the way that Barry approaches disability, so I suppose it's already been said, but it is advanced. It is not necessarily just replicating the sort of majority view of his period. It is much more inquisitive, and it's much more flexible, and actually much more therefore in tune with the kind of things that disability theorists are talking about decades later and that we're still talking about now.
Thanks. And I'm just going on to, I've got another question for Wyn here. And Wyn, this is a long, it's a detailed question, so I'm going to read the question actually from, it says, during the 20s and 30s, miners' institutes in Welsh valleys often screened European films, including Russian, German, Spanish films. And the photographer Edith Tudor Hart, who documented South Wales, was born in Vienna. And the question also mentions, of course, the artist Joseph Herman. So the question is, how important do you think the visual arts might have been in the relationship between Wales and Europe, bearing in mind, I suppose, that tradition of connection?
Well, first of all, let me admit that's an area, of course, outside my special discipline, but it's one I've always taken an interest in, and the one who's written a lot about it is Peter Lord. But I think that the visual arts have made a huge contribution to Welsh Europeanism. During the First World War, of course, there were artist refugees from Belgium welcome to Wales. And some of them, of course, created images here. And the Welsh Outlook, by the way, featured their work and featured them. So you start with that whole body of work. Well, you don't start there, but yeah, that's one obvious example of the Welsh Europeanism that emerged out of a direct encounter with European art. Between the two world wars, of course, you've got similar refugees from Nazi Germany also making their home in Wales and having a huge influence, not least, for example, on the work of the so-called Rhondda school that emerged immediately after the Second World War. German Expressionism came into Wales through those sorts of sources. That's how Welsh artists became increasingly aware of what had been happening and what was happening in the art, the avant-garde art, the progressive art of the continent. So in short, in other words, David, I think that's a whole area that Peter Lord has already, to be fair to him, explored in some depth, but there's far more work to be done. It's no coincidence, for example, that the most striking sculptural head of the great Welsh language poet Gwenallt was, of course, by a sculptor from the continent who settled in Pembrokeshire, and he and Gwenallt became very, very close friends. And indeed, Gwenallt addressed a poem to him. And that's the sort of symbiosis that you also could get even between European artists and Welsh creative writers, both in Welsh and in English.
Thanks, Wyn. And I'm just looking to see if there are a question here about, for those working on Ron Berry, about the development of art within the class struggle and alienation under artistic alienation under capitalism in Wales. And does Berry's work really reflect that alienation under capitalism? My guess is you're going to say yes, but Georgia, do you have feelings on that?
Sarah, you're going to have to help me on this one.
I'm a bit stuck with this one as well.
Berry was friends with an artist, wasn't he? He was friends with, his name has escaped me now. What's his name?
Chunks or Bob Thomas?
Yeah.
Can I come in on this as not as a very expert man? And what really drew me to Berry was the fact that there were obviously his physical injuries led to him moving on to other areas, trying to find other areas of work outside of mining. But I think on some level as well, his was a rejection of the very limited opportunities available to him as a worker, basically an uneducated worker at that time, at that place, which was, your choice is to leave school at 14, and if you don't carry on with school, you go down the mines. And I think what's important about his work is that, he rejected that form of alienation and the kind of life that very limited kind of life potentially that might have led to. So I think, yeah, he was very well aware of the alienation that comes from certain forms of capitalist industry. And, we should, take inspiration from the fact that he rejected that.
In terms of alienation as well, Berry, he vocalised the fact that he didn't want to be seen as one of the, as part of the Anglo-Welsh traditional writers. He also didn't want to be seen as a maverick of the genre. He just wanted to do his own thing. He was so independent in that respect. He spoke of his work. There's one line he said about his work, that they were all like pigeons, and he had absolutely no control over them. Once they'd been done and gone, that was it. So yeah, being part of a crowd or part of a circle probably wasn't that important to Berry.
You could say, David, that there was a touch of the professional rebel about Ron Berry. That is, it was important for him to be seen, to present himself as an outsider. I mean, that he was partly driven by that. It was an image that was at once a genuine reflection and also one that was carefully cultivated by him, it seems to me. And by the way, talking about someone who's out of place, he also, of course, was the most important industrial writer of post-industrial Wales. The industrial Wales really had already passed its peak by the end of the First World War. The 30s brought in the Depression, and that's when so many of the industrial writers really emerged that we're now familiar with. Berry was a post-Second World War writer about a Rhondda that by then, I know, I was born there, I was brought up there, was rapidly becoming a post-industrial. And he had mixed feelings about that. He felt displaced by it and betrayed by his own people, because he'd grown up believing, for example, in an iron Bevan. And then Bevan had ended up being, from Berry's point of view, a champagne socialist. He'd sold out the dream. And Berry was very, very aggrieved about that. It's one of the many chips he had on his shoulder. But he was also a tremendous writer who I think Georgia and Sarah would agree, he had a genius for actually coining the idiolect of the mind. He was the first of all the writers, really, to capture the way, the slang, and all the terms that are actually spoken underground. He wasn't afraid of using it, and he had a genius in the way that he did use it. So you really live the experience with him of going underground, and the sense of camaraderie that existed there, which is actually invested in the language. It's the language that's the power of his writing. He is a remarkable user of words because he goes to a source that nobody else had accessed, which is the source I've just described. Anyway, I'll stop there.
No, I think that actually that depiction of a writer being, as Georgia was saying, just himself, and at the same time that we can see from an analytical point of view that actually he was representing, because of his language skills, something much bigger, is very, very important to both analysts and people who are writing right now. That's you know. I'm just going to finish off. We're considerably over time, but Kirsty, sorry, Daniel, we've got one more.
Yeah, I'm just seeing two questions here regarding the question of BME writers and minority.
Sorry, and Kirsty has indicated she wanted to answer that. So,
okay, sorry.
I was just going there on that one.
Let Kirsty
as I think, so the question very broadly is this movement that Crew represents taking steps to include BAME writers? I think that's a kind of summary of the question's interest in a supportive kind of way. So, Kirsty, you want to speak on that, I think?
Yeah, sorry, it's not so much that I wanted to speak on things, I've been trying to manage the questions and pressing the wrong button every so often, but I do want us to respond, so maybe I'll say something and pass it to Daniel. Sure. This sounds like a staged response, but only this morning I was in discussion with a prospective PhD student on a thesis on BAME representation in Welsh writing in English. Now that's not enough, and I think, you know, it's certainly a question that it's discussed in various books, you know, on short stories from Leonora Brito, for example, or Charlotte Williams's work on sugar in slate, Trusat Sapadi. I mean, it's there, but no, there's no a single sort of study on sort of multi-ethnic Wales. I think that's the term in the question as well. But it is, and race within Welsh writing in English has been discussed quite a lot. But there's certainly much more interest now, as I said, you know, getting PhD inquiries, and so many of our books have come from PhDs in Swansea or elsewhere. So yeah, it's definitely within our sights. But I think Daniel would have something more to say, because he's done work on there's been lots of Jewish representation in Welsh writing in English that's been studied by Jasmine Donaghy, but Daniel has also worked on Wales and African American writing. So I'll just stop talking and hand it over to him.
Yeah, well, the nature of one of the questions was what we broadly thought of the subject of diversity and multiculturalism and so forth. And I guess there are two aspects to that. One is that the diversity of Wales itself is kind of the very point of what we do, right? Minority cultures are often viewed in rather homogeneous terms from the outside, from metropolitan perspectives, and Wales not least among them, breaking up those kind of stereotypes, emphasizing the diversity, is what the kind of cultural studies we do in Crew is all about. As Kirsty said, there are some studies within the various volumes in the collection of some of the key writers, but we don't have a sustained analysis of BME writers, and that would be great. There isn't a standard history of Tiger Bay itself that could be turned to. You know, this is real fruitful ground for future research. My own book was on the relationships between African Americans and Wales, a seemingly unlikely subject, but with its roots in translations of slave narratives and the connections of Paul Robeson in Wales. Ralph Ellison began writing Invisible Man, his seminal text, while a GI in Swansea. There are also connections of that kind, but it didn't ignore either the reality of actual Black communities in Tiger Bay. Paul Robeson's uncle, Aaron Moselle, lived in Tiger Bay. We're not quite sure why. I think he escaped the Red Scare in 1919, but he became a very prominent Pan-Africanist, speaking at the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, but based in Cardiff. I make the case actually that the Black nationalism predates Welsh nationalism, in the sense that the Marcus Garvey movement had two cells in South Wales, in Cardiff and in Barry by 1924, whereas Plaid Cymru hadn't come into existence until 1925. So there are lots of interesting things like that. One other quick point is that in the literature, the Welsh often imagine themselves as ethnic others. So in Caradog Evans' My People, as Jasmine Donaghy argues, the Welsh are kind of constructed as Jewish. The idea of the Black Welshman, the connection with Paul Robeson. Charlotte Williams says, well, if the Welshman is a Black man at heart, what about Welsh people who are actually Black? So the danger is a kind of appropriation, right? There are actual Jewish people in Wales, actual Afro-Caribbean Welsh, and the exploration of that kind of interface, I think is interesting. And you know, worthy of theorization in relation to race studies and ethnic studies, but also is a key chapter in the history of Welsh culture as well. So bring in your proposals. That's the main response, I think.
Well, we do have a student at the moment who is a PhD student who is writing a film about Robeson in Wales, which will be fascinating. Nick Davis. And what you said, you mentioned there, Daniel, the idea that the Welsh were equated with Jewish people, and therefore what about real Jewish people? Well, actually, we've got a question that is saying, that is asking, and I think probably, Daniel, this is yours again, is what about, can we explore more the contribution of Jewish between the wars migrants to Wales from the European mainland, escaping Nazism?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, there is a fair bit of work going on. I mean, this is one of the areas of development in Welsh studies, especially in history. But Jasmine Donaghy, of course, who's with you in creative writing, David, but also a very fine critic. Her book on representation of Jewish people in particular in Welsh writing opens up all kinds of avenues of research. I see the question is asking for a little more information. The artistic impact of Jewish expressionist painters after the Second World War was absolutely immense. And yeah, the full cultural effect of that has not been fully explored. Figures like Heinz Koppel, who created a kind of art school in Dowlais. John Uzzell Edwards, a painter from the Rhymney Valley, leading Welsh expressionist. I remember having a chat with him and just asking him whether Heinz Koppel was a figure of any significance, and he remembered his father taking him to the art workshop in Dowlais, and the smell of the paint as a child making him an artist in a sense. So then there's Ernest Zaboli, we've heard about Joseph Herman. This is sort of a Jewish Welsh formation of artists that revolutionized Welsh culture in the post-war years. And there's a lot of work that has been done. But the links between that then and literature is interesting. Jasmine herself has done a lot of work on Lily Tobias, a trilingual writer, Welsh, Yiddish, and English speaker, the aunt of Leo and Danny Absey, maybe the most prominent of Welsh Jewish figures in the second half of the 20th century. But that whole area of research is very, very fruitful grounds for further research. And again, part of this process of diversifying our conceptions of Welshness. And it's not just English language Wales either. Someone like Kate Bosa-Griffiths writing in Welsh and the diversity of Welsh language culture itself. Welsh language culture is also multiculturalism, let alone the fundamental bilingualism of Wales. So these complexities are precisely what future generations will be looking at. I hope there'll be jobs for them and funding for that kind of work, because it's fundamental to how we conceive of Wales and its future.
That's fantastic, Daniel, and it's a good note to. Sorry, Wyn, were you trying to come in there?
No, I was just going to remind you, just one sentence. Talking about Kate Griffiths, of course, what's very important there is Heine Griffiths' memoir of his mother and the remarkable story of her family in Germany, and then, of course, her transfer to Wales. What's the title of it in English, Daniel? Do you remember? I don't remember. It was translated
in Welsh. I don't remember there's a translation.
One Welsh Book of the Year. Anyway, Heine Griffith is the author to look out for, because that's a remarkable account of Wales's indebtedness, as it were, to European Jewry, in the form of his reminiscence about his own family.
I think that the opening gambit of this whole thing was Wales and the world, and we've certainly seen the massive contribution that Crew is making to the idea of Wales and the world, Welsh writing and the world, Welsh writing in English and the world. And thanks to everybody for joining us. And I'm bringing the proceedings to a close. Thanks and goodbye.